If you are running Windows 10 or Windows 11, there's a mandatory update heading to your machine right now, and before you let it install, you need to H-ear everything I'm about to tell you. Because this is not a normal Patch Tuesday. This is not a clean, straightforward security rollout that you just click accept on and forget about. This month's Microsoft update. Is a combination of things happening simultaneously that, depending on your specific hardware, your current Windows version, and a handful of settings on your machine you have probably never touched, could leave your computer stuck at a black screen, unable to boot, asking you for a recovery key you have never seen before, or running noticeably. Slower on your internet connection after it finishes installing. And here's the part that makes this worse than a normal problematic update situation. Microsoft itself, as of this recording, has not publicly acknowledged most of the issues users are already reporting. The health dashboard shows no known problems. The official release notes say nothing about these reports. And yet, he forum threads, the Reddit posts, the Microsoft queue and A boards, and the community feedback pages are filling up in real time with users, describing the exact same set of problems on the exact SAME update. So today, we are going to break down exactly what this update contains, what it is doing that nobody is talking about, who specifically is at risk, what you should do right now before you let Windows install anything, and if you are already affected, how to get your machine working again. Let us start with what actually shipped. On May 13th, 2026, Microsoft released its monthly Patch Tuesday updates. For Windows 11 users on versions 24H2 and 25H2, the update is KB 5089549. For users still on the older Windows 11 version 23H2, it is KB 5087420. For Windows 10 users who have paid for or are enrolled in Extended Security Updates, it is KB 5087544. These are mandatory security updates, and Windows will download them automatically unless you have gone out of your way to pause or block up dates. On the surface, the numbers look impressive. 120 security vulnerabilities patched in a single release. 17 of those rated as critical. 14 of the critical flaws involve remote code execution, meaning attackers could potentially run their own malicious programs on your machine just by getting you to visit a specially crafted website, open a rigged document, or connect to a poisoned network. The DNS client vulnerability in this release, for example, means a malicious DNS server could send your Windows machine a specially formatted response that corrupts memory and allows remote code execution at the network level without you clicking anything at all. By the pure security numbers, this is a release you absolutely need. But the way Microsoft has packaged and deployed it is creating problems that are, for some users, every bit as disruptive as the vulnerabilities it is trying to fix. The first problem is the install failure loop. Since KB 5089549 rolled out to Windows 11 devices, a growing number of users are reporting that the update downloads, begins installing, reaches somewhere around 35 to 36% completion, and then fails. Windows rolls back to the previous version, shows the message, saying something did not go as planned and that it is undoing changes, and then starts the whole process again the next time you check for updates. This is not a one-off report from a handful of Edge-CAS-E machines. The threads collecting these reports span Reddit, NeoWin forums, the Bleeping Computer community, and Microsoft's own feedback channels, and the volume has been growing steadily since the update rolled out. The rollback behavior is important to understand. Because Windows is failing and rolling back rather than failing and getting stuck, most people are not left WWs by the completely broken system. What they are left with is a machine that has spent hours attempting and failing to install a mandatory security patch, is still unprotected against the vulnerabilities that patch was supposed to fix, and will keep retrying automatically until either the user intervenes or Microsoft quietly patches the issue on the back end. Microsoft's own documentation has now confirmed one specific cause of these failures for certain machines. The error code 0800F0922 is triggered on devices where the EFI system partition, which is a small dedicated partition on your drive that handles the boot process, has 10 megabytes or less of free space available. When the update tries to write new, secure boot certificate files to that partition during the reboot phase, there is not enough room. The write fails, and the whole installation rolls back with that error. If you have ever heard of the EFI partition and had no reason to care about it before today, welcome to the club. Most Windows users have no idea it exists, no idea how full it is, and no idea they need D to worry about it. But with this particular update, it matters. Microsoft's guidance for fixing it involves backing up your registry and editing partition tables, which is the kind of step that can easily make things significantly worse if done incorrectly. The documentation specifically warns that editing the registry incorrectly can cause system issues. That is their way of saying proceed with extreme caution, which is not a phrase you want to encounter when all you were trying to do was let Windows update itself like normal. October 14th, 2025. That was the day Windows 10 died. Real value. When building a coalition of countries that all have an interest in seeing this new trade architecture succeed. However, this is where things take a serious turn. Because not everyone is comfortable with what MBS is building, a strategic chess match being played in real time. With infrastructure, proxy forces, and hundreds of Saudi Arabia is not just building infrastructure. It is building dependency. That is a transformation of almost unimaginable ambition. The willingness of China, which buys more Saudi oil, has been building its conventional superiority on the same foundation. We built a response to your pattern, and when the moment was right, we showed you that your pattern could be placements that will shape procurement decisions, doctrine revisions, and training requirements for the next decade. Abre su computadora, ciclo, ya es tiempo de es building a coalition of countries that all have an interest in seeing this new trade architecture succeed. A strategic chess match being played in real time. With infrastructure, proxy forces, and hundreds of File Explorer becomes Nemo. The control panel becomes System Settings. Notepad becomes Text Editor. The logic is identical, just with different labels. And Mint is built on top of Ubuntu, which means it has access to tens of thousands of software packages, broad hardware compatibility, and a community of tens of millions of people who have already solved whatever problem you're going to encounter. The current version, Mint 22, is based on Ubuntu 24.04 and is supported with security updates until 2029. That's 3 more years of free, no questions asked updates on hardware that Windows 11 told you was too old to use. Zorin OS goes even further in mimicking Windows visually. If Mint says, we'll make something familiar, Zorin says, we'll make something identical. The developers built a feature called Zorin Appearance that lets you switch your desktop layout to look like Windows 11 or Windows 10 or even older versions. And it actually looks like those things. The icons, the spacing, the system fonts, the context menus. It's engineered to minimize the feeling that you've changed anything at all. Zorin also saw an enormous spike in downloads immediately after Windows 10's end of support. In the 2 days after October 14th, 2025, Zorin OS was downloaded roughly 100,000 times, and most of those downloads were coming from people making this exact switch. The free version of Zorin, called Zorin Core, is completely functional. You're not missing anything critical. There's also a paid Pro version at around $47 that unlocks some extra desktop layouts and app bundles, but you absolutely don't need it to start. Ubuntu is the third option, and it's the one with the biggest community and the most documentation. If you search for how to do anything on Linux, the answer you find is almost certainly written for Ubuntu. Every tutorial, every Stack Overflow answer, every YouTube walkthrough, they all assume Ubuntu. That has real value. When something goes wrong, which occasionally it will, the ability to copy an error message, paste it into a search engine, and immediately find a specific answer that works for your exact setup is worth more than almost any technical advantage any other distribution might have. The Ubuntu desktop, called GNOME, looks a bit more like Mac OS than Windows. There's a dock on the side, a top bar, a slightly different way of doing things, but it's extremely polished, and most people adapt to it within a few days. Ubuntu's long-term support version, 24.04, is supported until 2029 with regular updates. And Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, offers a program called Ubuntu Pro that extends security patching to 10 years for free on personal devices. Building a coalition of countries that all have an interest in seeing this new trade architecture succeed. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. A Red Sea-centered trade network is enormously valuable to Cairo, which is why Saudi Arabia has been one of Egypt's most important financial backers, pouring in tens of billions in support at critical moments. Jordan needs access to global markets and investment. Sitting on the edge of Neom, it suddenly finds itself adjacent to one of the largest infrastructure projects in human history. And then there is Israel. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, normalized relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Saudi Arabia did not formally sign. But behind the scenes, the relationship between Riyadh and Tel Aviv has been carefully evolving. And the geography of Neom, sitting at the corner where Saudi Arabia and Israel nearly touch, has made that relationship more practically significant than almost anyone is openly discussing. A connected Red Sea corridor, linking Saudi logistics with Israeli ports, Egyptian infrastructure, and Jordanian access routes, starts to look less like a construction project, and more like a new geopolitical alliance built in concrete and fiber optic cables. However, this is where things take a serious turn, because not everyone is comfortable with what MBS is building. Iran sees the entire Vision 2030 infrastructure push as a direct strategic threat. Every pipeline expanded, every port deepened, every billion invested in the Red Sea corridor is a direct reduction in Tehran's ability to hold Riyadh at risk. And Iran has not been passive. The Houthi movement in Yemen, which Iran arms and supports, has already demonstrated that it is willing and able to attack Saudi infrastructure. The 2019 drone strikes on the Abqaiq and Khurais oil facilities, the most sophisticated oil processing complex on Earth, were a direct message. Iran was showing Saudi Arabia that no matter what it builds, no matter how many backup routes it creates, its infrastructure is vulnerable. And since the Gaza conflict escalated in late 2023, Houthi forces in Yemen have taken that threat into the Red Sea itself, launching missiles and drone attacks at commercial shipping in the very corridor that MBS is betting his entire legacy on. Think about that for a moment. MBS is spending hundreds of billions to bypass Hormuz and pivot to the Red Sea, and Iran is now actively threatening the Red Sea. This isn't coincidence. This is a strategic chess match being played in real time, with infrastructure, proxy forces, and hundreds of billions of dollars as the pieces. The question that no one can definitively answer is this: can MBS build faster than Iran can disrupt? Because here's the brutal reality of the situation. The Strait of Hormuz bypass strategy only works if the alternative routes remain secure, and right now, those alternative routes are being contested. Shipping insurance rates through the Red Sea have spiked dramatically. Major carriers have rerouted ships around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and massive costs to global supply chains. The economic disruption has been enormous, and NEOM, despite its stunning architectural renders, is still years away from becoming the functioning global hub MBS envisions. But what happened next might be the most important part of this entire story, because MBS has not backed down, not even slightly. If anything, the pressure in the Red Sea seems to have accelerated Saudi Arabia's timeline, not slowed it. Investment into port security, naval capability, and infrastructure hardening has intensified. Saudi Arabia has been deepening its coordination with the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. It has been investing in its own missile defense systems at an unprecedented rate. And diplomatically, MBS has been on a global tour, meeting with Chinese leadership, Indian Prime Minister Modi, European heads of state, anyone who depends on stable energy flows and might benefit from a secure Red Sea corridor. Because this is the other dimension of the plan that rarely gets discussed. Saudi Arabia is not just building infrastructure, it is building dependency. The more countries rely on Saudi Red Sea routes for their energy and trade, the more those countries have an interest in keeping those routes safe. And the more countries that have an interest in keeping those routes safe, the more pressure they apply to any actor that tries to threaten them. MBS is essentially trying to turn Saudi Arabia from a country that needs protection into a country that provides protection. From a nation that begs great powers to keep its oil flowing, to a nation that manages the infrastructure on which great power economies depend. That is a transformation of almost unimaginable ambition. And whether it succeeds or fails will depend on factors that no blueprint can fully control. The trajectory of the Iran nuclear negotiations, the duration of the Yemen conflict, the pace of the global energy transition, the willingness of China, which buys more Saudi oil than the political pressure generated by that question is as valuable to its strategic objectives as the burning wreckage itself. Because a military that is simultaneously fighting an enemy and fighting a domestic political accountability crisis is not operating at full efficiency. Its commanders are distracted. Its decision-making is constrained by political considerations. Its institutional confidence, all the bedrock of effective military planning and aggressive tactical execution, is shaken. Shaken confidence makes armies cautious. Caution in ground combat makes armies predictable. Predictable armies are easier to ambush. This is the cycle that Hezbollah has initiated. And it is not a cycle that ends when the smoke clears from the valley. Look further outward. Look at the implications for NATO doctrine, for American military planning in the Pacific, for every military that has been building its conventional superiority on the same foundational assumptions that Israel built its doctrine on. Because the message from southern Lebanon is not addressed only to Jerusalem. It is addressed to every military establishment that believes that sensor networks and armor and unmanned aerial vehicles create an insurmountable advantage over a sufficiently motivated, sufficiently resourced, and sufficiently intelligent adversary. The message is, we studied you, we found your pattern, we built a response to your pattern, and when the moment was right, we showed you that your pattern could be broken. Russia has been reading this message carefully in the context of its own conflict in Ukraine. The exchange of hard-won tactical lessons between the Iran-Russia axis is bidirectional. What Hezbollah learns about defeating Western Standard armor in Lebanon flows back to Moscow. And what Russia learns about defeating drone-supported operations in Ukraine flows to Tehran and then to Hezbollah. This is a learning network, a distributed military innovation system that operates without the bureaucratic inertia of formal military establishments. It is faster than it looks, and it is producing results. The American military advisors, watching this engagement from their bases and their command centers in the region, are updating threat assessments that will shape procurement decisions, doctrine revisions, and training requirements for the next decade. Because if IT can happen to the Israeli military, it can happen to any military operating on the same foundational assumptions. And they are all operating on the same foundational assumptions. Precision matters. Technology replaced. The Merkava production line will continue. Trophy will be upgraded. The Namer variants will receive enhanced protection packages. The D9 will get additional armor. The drone network will be hardened against electronic warfare. Israel is not finished. Its military capacity is not broken. Its will to defend itself is not in doubt. But something more important than any of those platforms was damaged in that valley. The certainty was damaged. The unspoken, deeply embedded, culturally reinforced certainty that Israeli technology and Israeli training meant that certain outcomes were guaranteed. That the machines were invincible enough, the tactics were sound enough, the intelligence was comprehensive enough that a catastrophic surprise was effectively impossible. Certainty in military affairs is never warranted. Every military that has operated under the assumption of certainty has eventually been given a brutal lesson in the difference between confidence and arrogance. The Israelis know this. Their own history teaches it. 1973 teaches it with particular force. But knowing something in the abstract and believing it in the operational planning room are different things. And the gap between abstract knowledge and operational belief is where disasters grow. The valley in southern Lebanon was that gap made physical. The soldiers who ran from burning Merkava tanks were not cowards. They were not poorly trained. They were not the failure. They were the consequence. The consequence of a gap between what TE enemy was assessed to be and what the enemy actually was. The consequence of a doctrine that had not been fully stress-tested against a threat that had been evolving with patient, funded, and extremely intelligent deliberation for 2 decades. They will go back in. The Israeli military will re-enter southern Lebanon. It will fight. It will adapt. It has always adapted. The question is what it will find when it does. Whether Hezbollah's next layer of preparation is already in place, whether the ambush of the 4 platforms was the opening act or the main event. Hezbollah has not said. It rarely does. What it has done is demonstrate, in the most unambiguous possible terms, that the rules of engagement in southern Lebanon have changed, that the weapons that Israel called indestructible are not, that 2 waves, planned with precision and executed with discipline, can break a column that cost billions to build and decades to train. And somewhere in the tunnels beneath those hills, fighters who carve. Hay una conversación que pasa en millones de casas cada semana. Alguien abre su computadora, espera un poco más, suspira y le dice a alguien cercano, necesito una computadora nueva, esta ya no sirve. Y la persona cercana pregunta cuántos años tiene. Y la respuesta es 8, 9, 10 años. Y entonces viene el diagnóstico automático. Ya cumplió su ciclo, ya es tiempo de cambiarla, así son las cosas. Pero hay algo que nadie en esa conversación está cuestionando. Nadie está preguntando si el problema es realmente el hardware o si el problema es el software que está aplastando ese hardware desde adentro. Nadie está preguntando si esa misma máquina, con el sistema operativo correcto, no se sentiría completamente diferente. Y la respuesta a esa pregunta, que casi nadie hace, es lo que este video existe para responder. Porque hay 2 mundos completamente distintos que puedes crear con el mismo hardware viejo. En un mundo, instalas Windows 11 usando el método de bypass que funciona, aunque Microsoft diga que tu máquina no es compatible, y te sientas a trabajar en una computadora que respira con dificultad desde el primer minuto. En el otro, instalas Zorin OS, y la misma máquina que antes se sentía cansada de repente se siente ágil, inmediata, viva. No porque haya cambiado ningún componente físico, sino porque el software que corre sobre ese hardware hace demandas completamente distintas sobre él. Y la diferencia entre esas 2 demandas es tan grande, tan medible, tan real en el día a día, que cuando la ves con tus propios ojos por primera vez te preguntas